John and Emma had been living in a small town in Virginia for years. Their life, by all appearances, was stable. John worked as a sales manager, and Emma was an interior designer. They had built a comfortable home, surrounded by nature and quiet streets, far from the busy hum of city life. They enjoyed the peace that came with their town and the predictable rhythm of their daily lives. From the outside, they looked like a happy couple, one who had figured out the secrets to a harmonious marriage. But that evening, everything changed. It was a quiet, unassuming night when Emma made a statement that would shift everything between them. She casually remarked, "I'm carrying this relationship alone." The words fell from her lips without any hesitation. No build-up, no explanation. She didn't wait for John to respond. Instead, she sat there with her arms crossed, waiting for an apology she wasn't even sure he could offer. Emma didn't elaborate, didn't give an example, just stated it as if it were an undeniable truth. John stared at her, stunned. The words hung in the air, heavy, sharp. He didn't know how to react at first. What did she mean by that? Did she really believe it? Had she felt this way for a while? John was no stranger to their routine, to the responsibilities he had quietly taken on for years. Everything from managing the bills to preparing their meals, and everything in between. He had always prided himself on being dependable, on helping make things easier for Emma. But now, her words had shattered the illusion. It was clear she felt burdened, as if she were carrying the weight of their relationship on her own shoulders. And that stung. That wasn't how John saw things. He wasn't sure when it had all shifted, but this wasn't something they had discussed, not something he had been aware of. For a moment, he thought about arguing, about defending himself, about offering an explanation. But he didn't. Instead, something shifted inside him. What if she really did feel like this? What if this wasn't just a passing frustration, but something deeper? Rather than argue, John decided to stop doing what he had always done. It wasn't an angry decision, but one that felt like the only option left. If Emma truly believed she was doing it all, then maybe it was time for her to experience the consequences of her words. The next morning, John didn't wake up early to make coffee. He didn't get up at his usual time to start their day, as he always had. Emma, groggy from sleep, noticed the empty coffee pot and looked around in confusion, but didn't ask about it. She made coffee for herself, but didn't offer to make it for John, as she usually would have. It was such a small, subtle change, but it was a start. John simply sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, as if nothing had changed. He didn't explain his actions or offer an apology. When they got home later that evening, Emma went into the kitchen, expecting John to ask about dinner, but he didn't. He didn't ask if she wanted anything or start preparing a meal, which was his usual role. Instead, he sat on the couch, flicking through channels on the TV, seemingly unbothered by the silence hanging in the air. Emma, unsure of how to respond, made a sandwich for herself, eating in the kitchen without offering anything to John. The meal wasn't a big deal, but the silence that followed was palpable. John wasn't going to do what he had always done. He wasn't going to pick up the slack. And so it began. The small, seemingly insignificant changes in their daily routine started to grow. John, usually the one to remind Emma about bills, stopped doing so. He didn't plan their weekends, didn't start conversations. He didn't initiate anything anymore. His silence was a quiet protest against the idea that he had been the one who wasn't doing enough. He wanted Emma to see the effects of her words, to understand what it felt like when everything fell on her shoulders. At first, Emma was irritated. She would mutter to herself when she saw the dishes pile up in the sink or when she had to take out the trash. She didn't understand why John wasn't doing these things anymore, and yet she didn't ask him about it. She just did them herself, silently frustrated by his behavior. But John didn't budge. He stayed silent, watching the situation unfold. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to get back at her. He simply wanted her to feel the weight of what she had so casually dismissed. And he wasn't going to make it easy for her. The silence between them grew, slowly and steadily, until it filled their house. Every small action that John refused to take, every time he didn't fulfill his usual responsibilities, added a layer to the tension. What had once been a rhythm, a partnership of give and take, now felt like a disconnect. But John wasn't going to fix it. Not this time. If Emma truly believed she was doing it all, then let her see what it felt like to have to do it all by herself. Each small change, each refusal to act, became a symbol of the imbalance Emma had accused him of. It wasn't just about household chores or managing their responsibilities. It was about recognition, about feeling like the work they both put into their marriage was acknowledged. Emma hadn't realized how much she relied on John to do everything, but John was about to show her. The shift in responsibility was subtle, but its consequences were far from invisible. As the days passed, the weight of what John had silently stopped doing began to sink in. Emma's frustration grew, but she still couldn't bring herself to ask him why he wasn't doing what he had always done. Instead, she simmered in silence, just as John had. The slow shift in their relationship had begun, and neither one of them could ignore it anymore. This was only the beginning. The days after Emma's declaration felt different. At first, it wasn't obvious, just small changes, little things that John stopped doing. But as time passed, the absence of his usual actions became more pronounced. Emma could feel it, even if she didn't fully understand it at first. The morning after John had stopped making coffee, Emma stumbled into the kitchen, expecting the usual warm scent to greet her. But the pot was empty, and John wasn't bustling around like he usually did. She didn't say anything, though. There was no question. She simply filled the pot herself, as if it were just another morning. She wasn't angry, but there was something about the silence that unsettled her. She brewed the coffee and went about her morning routine, but there was a strange emptiness in the air. By the time Emma left for work, she had almost forgotten about the shift in their dynamic. But as the day went on, it lingered in the back of her mind. The thought that John had simply stopped doing the things he always did, the little gestures of care, the way he always took the initiative, it had left a void. And though she didn't acknowledge it, that void grew with every passing day. That evening, when Emma came home, she expected John to ask about dinner, to make some suggestion about what they should have. It was his role, after all. But instead, John sat on the couch, remote in hand, eyes on the TV. No questions, no suggestions. Just silence. Emma stood there for a moment, caught in the awkwardness of the moment. She made a sandwich for herself, the quiet stretching between them like a heavy blanket. She didn't offer him any, but neither did John ask for anything. Emma ate, lost in her thoughts, wondering why John hadn't said anything. He always took care of these little things. Why hadn't he stepped up? By now, she was starting to feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't just the coffee or the dinner. It was everything. John wasn't offering to take care of the responsibilities that had always been his. He wasn't helping with the little things that made their lives run smoothly. And instead of being grateful for the time and space it gave her, Emma began to feel more and more uncomfortable. The next morning, John didn't ask her if she wanted coffee, didn't remind her about the bills, didn't plan their weekend like he used to. It was as if the role he had always played was slipping away, and Emma couldn't figure out what was happening. She began to feel a little uneasy, unsure of what to do with the sudden emptiness that filled their home. At first, Emma tried to fill the silence herself. She started asking questions, trying to provoke some reaction from John, trying to get him to step back into his usual role. "What do you want for dinner?" she asked one night, expecting him to take the lead, as he always had. But he didn't. He didn't even look up from the TV. Instead of feeling relieved by the space John had given her, Emma felt a growing frustration. The weight of everything, from household chores to planning their days, suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. She had never fully realized how much she relied on John to manage the details, the logistics, until now. As the days turned into weeks, Emma's irritation grew. The dishes piled up, the laundry went undone, and the trash remained full. Every small task, every responsibility John had taken care of, now felt like an enormous weight pressing down on her. She began to see how much he had been doing behind the scenes, quietly managing things without ever asking for recognition. She had assumed it was just part of his role, that it was easy for him. But now, she saw the reality. Emma began to feel overwhelmed. She was doing it all, but she was doing it with resentment in her heart. She resented the mess that John had once taken care of. She resented the fact that, for the first time, she was the one cleaning up, the one cooking dinner, the one making sure the bills were paid on time. The realization was a punch in the gut, and it made her feel vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. But even with all this frustration, Emma couldn't bring herself to ask John for help. She wouldn't admit that she had underestimated everything he had done for their marriage. The silence between them had become a wall, and though she could see the cracks in it, she wasn't ready to address what had caused it. It wasn't until she came home one day to find John sitting in the same spot on the couch, as usual, that it all started to hit her. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, realizing that he wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to punish her. He was just silent. He wasn't trying to force a change. He wasn't trying to manipulate her emotions. He was simply not doing what he had always done. He was letting her experience the weight of their life together. And Emma, for the first time, felt it. The silence was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of words. It was the absence of the actions that had once been so natural. Emma realized that she had taken all of it for granted. As the days stretched on, Emma became more and more aware of how the balance had shifted. The responsibilities that had once been shared between them were now all on her shoulders, and she didn't know how to carry it. Every task felt like a reminder of how much John had been doing behind the scenes. She couldn't help but wonder, would he ever step back into the role he had played, or was this what their relationship had become? The weight of it all began to sink in, and Emma started to realize that things couldn't stay this way. But even as she acknowledged this, she still didn't know how to change it. As the days passed, the silence in the house became a constant presence, settling over everything they did. Emma started to notice the small things that John had always done without complaint, without asking for recognition, and how they were now missing from their daily lives. She started to feel the weight of his absence, not in terms of his physical presence, but in the absence of the little gestures that had once made their life together feel stable and comfortable. At first, Emma tried to brush it off. She rolled her eyes when the dishes piled up, grumbling to herself when the trash wasn't taken out. She had never had to think about these things before. John had always taken care of them. Now, she was faced with the reality of having to manage every aspect of their home life on her own, and it was exhausting. One night, she finally reached her breaking point. She had come home late from work, tired and frazzled. As she walked into the kitchen, she saw the pile of dishes in the sink and the empty trash can in the corner. Her first instinct was to shout for John, to demand that he help, but then she remembered he wasn't going to do it. Not anymore. She had to face it. If she wanted something done, she was going to have to do it herself. Her frustration was building, but instead of confronting John, she buried it inside. She made dinner for herself, ignoring the empty chair at the table where John would normally sit. The silence between them felt heavier than ever before. John sat on the couch, completely uninterested in the meal she had made, and didn't even acknowledge the effort she had put into it. Emma didn't say anything either, but she couldn't help but feel hurt. The absence of his usual gestures, the simple "thank you" or "this looks great," was like a physical blow. The following morning, Emma woke up early to start her day, but her body felt more tired than it had in weeks. She hadn't slept well, and the exhaustion wasn't just physical. She felt emotionally drained from trying to keep everything together. She went into the kitchen to make coffee, but the moment she opened the cupboard, she realized she was out of beans. She cursed under her breath, knowing that John would have been the one to restock them. He always had. But now, it was up to her to remember these details, to manage everything herself. She could hear him in the other room, watching TV, seemingly unaware of the toll that the responsibilities were taking on her. He hadn't offered to help with anything, not in the morning or the night before. Emma wasn't sure if it was because he had stopped caring or if he was still waiting for her to ask. But she had already decided she wasn't going to ask. She didn't want to beg him to do something he had always done willingly. She didn't want to be the one who had to plead for his attention. The more Emma thought about it, the more she realized how much she had taken for granted. John had always been the one who kept things running smoothly, the one who picked up the slack without ever complaining. And now, it was as if he had simply stopped. The weight of their marriage, The weight of their life together had shifted, and Emma was struggling to carry it alone. The frustration she felt towards John began to simmer, slowly turning into something deeper, something darker. She started to resent him for his silence, for making her feel as though she was the only one working to keep their life intact. But at the same time, a part of her understood what he was doing. She had accused him of doing nothing, of not pulling his weight, and now she was seeing what it really meant when someone didn't step in to help. It wasn't just about the dishes or the bills. It was about the emotional labor, the responsibility of holding their life together. And for the first time, Emma was truly seeing what that felt like. But the more she saw, the more she struggled to admit to herself that she had been wrong. She couldn't bring herself to apologize, not yet. It was easier to stay angry, to blame him for everything, than to face the truth. She had underestimated him. She had assumed he was the one who wasn't doing enough, when in fact he had been silently carrying the load all along. Emma's exhaustion grew with each passing day. She was overwhelmed by the tasks that once felt small and manageable. The dishes, the laundry, the bills, they were no longer simple chores. They were constant reminders of the imbalance that had grown between them. And the more she struggled, the more she resented John for not helping. But the more she resented him, the more she realized that she was alone in this. She had assumed that John would always be there to pick up the pieces, but now that he wasn't, she saw how much she had relied on him. It wasn't just the work that was overwhelming. It was the emotional weight, the realization that their relationship wasn't as solid as she had always believed. John's silence wasn't just about the chores. It was about the distance that had crept in between them, the unspoken frustration that neither of them had addressed. They were both trapped in their own pride, unwilling to admit the truth, unwilling to be vulnerable. The cracks in their relationship were beginning to show, and neither of them knew how to fix them. Emma wasn't sure if she was angry at John for his silence, or if she was angry at herself for not seeing the truth earlier. She was starting to realize how much she had taken him for granted, but the resentment she felt made it hard to even consider apologizing. One evening, after yet another frustrating day, Emma found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the mess around her, and wondering how things had gotten so complicated. She had stopped asking for help, stopped demanding attention from John, and now she was paying the price for it. The weight of everything was becoming too much to bear, and Emma knew it couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to change, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the truth about what needed to be fixed. The strain on Emma grew heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just the physical work, though the dirty dishes, overflowing trash, and undone laundry were constant reminders of how much she had to manage alone. What truly weighed on her was the emotional labor, suddenly being the only one in charge of their lives. She had never realized how much John had silently carried, not only around the house, but in their marriage. Now, with the weight of everything on her shoulders, she felt like she was sinking. Her frustration turned into bitterness. Every morning when she woke up, she felt tired, not just physically, but emotionally drained. It was as if the energy that had once been shared between them had been drained out, leaving only a vacuum. There were mornings when she would stand in front of the mirror, rubbing her tired eyes, wondering when things had become so difficult. She missed the days when she didn't have to worry about the little things, when John would remind her about the bills, plan their weekends, take care of the simple tasks. She had taken it all for granted. But now it was different. She had to make the coffee, plan the meals, check the bills. Every little responsibility was a burden, and the weight of it felt suffocating. There were days when she would stare at the mess in the kitchen and want to scream, but she didn't. She didn't know how to ask John for help, not after everything that had happened. She had accused him of doing nothing, and now he was doing nothing. She had set this in motion, and now she was stuck with the consequences. The breaking point came one evening after a particularly exhausting day. Emma had come home late from work, drained and emotionally spent. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, staring at the mess that had accumulated throughout the day. She was angry, tired, and didn't know how much more she could take. For the first time, The weight of her exhaustion broke through the wall she had built around herself. She realized just how much she had missed John's support, not just with the chores, but in every aspect of their life together. She had taken him for granted, and now it felt like everything was falling apart. That evening, John was sitting on the couch as usual, watching TV. Emma walked past him, her mind heavy with everything that had been left undone. She felt the anger bubbling inside her, but she didn't know how to voice it. She wanted to confront him, to demand that he take responsibility, but at the same time, she knew it wasn't fair. He hadn't been doing it all this time, but she hadn't either. The silence had made things worse. They were both trapped in it. John, who had silently withdrawn, and Emma, who was now overwhelmed by the weight of everything she had to do alone. Her exhaustion was becoming unbearable, both physically and emotionally. She had stopped taking care of herself in the midst of trying to keep everything together. She hadn't realized how much John had done for her, how much he had silently carried the weight of their life together. Now it was all on her, and it felt like she was drowning. The next morning, Emma woke up early again, but this time, she couldn't shake the feeling of being completely alone. She had spent the past few weeks trying to keep everything together, but she couldn't do it anymore. She had stopped asking for help, stopped asking for support, and now she was paying the price. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. The tiredness in her eyes was evident, but it wasn't just physical. It was the emotional toll of carrying everything on her own. For the first time, Emma realized that she had been wrong. She had assumed that John was doing nothing, that he wasn't pulling his weight. But now she could see the truth. John had been doing everything he could, quietly, silently, and she had never noticed. She had been so caught up in her own frustrations, in her own sense of being overwhelmed, that she had failed to see how much he had been doing for her. But the more Emma realized, the more difficult it became to admit. She had built up this wall, this belief that she was the only one working, and now it was coming crashing down. She felt ashamed of herself. She had let her pride get in the way, and now she was paying the price. Days passed, and Emma continued to struggle with the weight of everything. The dishes piled up, the trash overflowed, and she started to feel like she couldn't keep up. She didn't ask John for help. Not yet. She didn't know how to break the silence, how to ask him for what she needed. But she knew she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. One evening, Emma sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by unopened bills and takeout containers. She had just finished another long day at work and had come home to more of the same. The silence between them was suffocating. She didn't know how to bridge the gap, how to get back to a place where they could communicate and share the responsibility. She had been so focused on doing it all herself that she had lost sight of the partnership they had once shared. It was then, sitting in the kitchen, that the realization hit her hard. She had been so focused on being the one to carry everything, on proving that she could do it all, that she had ignored what John had been doing all along. She had assumed that he wasn't trying, that he wasn't taking responsibility, but now she could see the truth. John had been carrying the weight, silently and without recognition. And now, she was overwhelmed by it all, struggling to keep up with the very thing she had taken for granted. Emma's frustration began to shift, and in its place, a deep sense of regret started to grow. She had to face the fact that she had made a mistake. She had allowed pride and stubbornness to cloud her judgment, and now, everything was unraveling. But even as she realized the truth, she wasn't sure how to fix it. The distance between them had grown too wide, and she wasn't sure how to cross it. But she knew one thing for sure: something needed to change. The days that followed were filled with a sense of quiet desperation. Emma woke up tired, the weight of the tasks ahead of her pressing down on her. The house was more cluttered than it had ever been, the sink always full, the laundry piling up, and the bills scattered around as reminders of her growing to-do list. She moved through the house in a daze, like a person walking through a fog of exhaustion. The truth of how much John had done, how much he had quietly carried for them both, was beginning to sink in more deeply. But even as the realization hit her, she didn't know what to do with it. She couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine, like she could handle everything on her own. She had been so focused on proving herself capable, on showing John that she didn't need him to step in, that she had pushed him away. Now, with the weight of everything pressing down on her, she was at a breaking point. The silence between them was suffocating, and Emma knew that something had to change. But how? One evening, after another long day, Emma found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the unopened bills that had become a constant in her life. She felt overwhelmed, not just by the responsibilities that had always been there, but by the emotional weight of the distance that had grown between her and John. She looked at the empty chair across from her, the place where John usually sat, and felt a deep sense of loss. It wasn't just the tasks he used to take care of. It was the partnership, the understanding that had once existed between them. She had ignored it, dismissed it, and now she was paying the price. It wasn't until she sat there, looking at the mess around her, that Emma realized how far things had fallen. She had assumed she was the one carrying the weight of their marriage, the one doing all the work, but the truth was far different. John had always been there, silently handling things, making sure everything was running smoothly, even when she hadn't noticed. It wasn't just the chores or the bills. It was the emotional labor of keeping their lives in balance. And now, Emma could see that she had taken all of it for granted. Her heart felt heavy with regret. She had misunderstood John's silence, had assumed it meant he didn't care, that he wasn't trying. But now she realized it wasn't about not caring. It was about stepping back, giving her the space to understand what she had been blind to all these years. She hadn't seen it before, but now, as the weight of everything crushed down on her, she understood. She had been wrong. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with everything she had learned over the past few weeks. She thought about John, about his quiet patience, about how he had always been there, even when she hadn't appreciated it. She thought about the mistakes she had made, about the pride that had kept her from acknowledging the truth. She knew she had to make it right. But how? The next evening, after another long, exhausting day, Emma sat across from John in the dimly lit kitchen. The silence between them felt thicker than ever. She had avoided this conversation for so long, but now she couldn't put it off any longer. She had to admit the truth, not just to John, but to herself. "John," she said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. "I've been wrong." John didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. But Emma could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the same exhaustion she had been feeling. It wasn't just physical. It was the exhaustion of carrying a weight that no one seemed to notice. She swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. "I've been wrong about everything," Emma continued, her voice shaky. "I thought you weren't doing enough, that you weren't pulling your weight. But I see now that I've been blind. You've been carrying everything quietly, and I didn't even notice." The words felt like they were ripping something deep inside her, but they were the truth. She had taken John for granted, assuming that his silent efforts were just part of the job. She had never acknowledged how much he had been doing, how much he had been managing behind the scenes. And now, the weight of that realization hit her harder than she had expected. "I didn't appreciate you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was doing everything on my own, but I wasn't. You were always there, quietly handling everything. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not seeing it." For a long moment, there was only silence. John sat across from her, his expression still unreadable. Emma couldn't bear to look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. She had assumed that her apology would be enough, that it would fix everything. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it was only the beginning. Finally, John spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Emma, I'm not doing this to punish you. I just wanted you to see what it felt like. I've always done what I could to keep things running, to make sure you didn't have to worry. But I wanted you to see what it's like when the support you've always had isn't there anymore." His words hit Emma like a wave, and for the first time, she truly understood. She hadn't seen the impact of her words, of her actions, until it was too late. But now, she was seeing it clearly. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I see it now. I'm sorry for everything." John nodded, his eyes softening. There was no anger in his gaze, just a quiet understanding. He didn't need her apology to heal, but it was a start. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt like they were on the same page. The silence between them wasn't as suffocating anymore. They both understood that things needed to change, but for the first time, they were both willing to make the effort. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road they were willing to walk together. As they sat there, the weight of the past few weeks starting to lift, Emma realized that this was a new beginning. Not just for their marriage, but for their relationship as a whole. They both had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to do it. Together.